Good evening, everybody, to the Audit Committee at 7:30 on Wednesday, the 24th of January 2024. There are no fire alarms planned for this evening. Should the alarm sound, please leave via the nearest available emergency exit. Two of the closest exits are through the glass door behind you, to my left, and through the double doors onto the riverside behind you. In the event of an evacuation, please muster outside Café des Amis. Members of the public are welcome to make their own recordings of the meeting using whatever non-disruptive methods they think are suitable. This meeting is being minuted, recorded and audio live streamed via the Council's website. The Westergate garden gates on the riverside are locked at sunset, so members of the public must leave the Guildhall to the side exit behind the glass doors. We're going to move on to item 1, and that's apologies for absence. Do we have any apologies, Lauren?
We've got apologies from Councillor Dan Smith, Chair.
Thank you. And do we have any substitutes?
We have Councillor Peter Old for Councillor Dan Smith.
Thank you. Item 3, do we have any declarations of interest by members or officers?
We have none in advance, Chair.
Great, thank you. We'll move on to item 4, which is the minutes from the 4th of October 2023. And do we have an agreement that these are a true record? And can we have that by general assent? Would you agree? Great, thank you. Councillor Old?
I wasn't present at the previous meeting, so I can't say it was a true record. I could say it was a record, but I can't say it's a true record.
Okay, thank you. We move on to item 5, public participation. I understand there are no speakers for this meeting. Sorry, I stole your pen. So this is quick. Move on to item 6. Councillor Interest Governance Review. This will be to note the report of the Corporate Service Director and Head of Paid Service and the outcome of this audit and the related action. I believe Tricia will be introducing the report. Then we'll move to Christine to make some comments, and I think Jan following that. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. Yes, I'm just going to very briefly introduce the report. Christine Parker will talk about the actual audit work that the team's undertaken, and then Jan will talk about the recommendations and how those are being implemented. So we'll take it in that process. So, as I'm sure you're aware, we commissioned East Kent Audit Partnership to carry out an audit of our governance processes around local plan interests, and the terms of reference for that review are set out under the introduction to the report on page 13. The scope, the terms of reference was agreed with the group leaders, but we do know there have been a number of questions, and at various stages we've released information concerning this matter. So we thought it would be useful just to put in this covering report a summary of the information that's not covered in the scope of the audit review, just so it's all in one place and it's quite transparent. So that's set out on pages 14, 15 and 16. So I'm going to hand across to Christine next and then Jan. Thank you.
Thank you. Good evening, members. The report is shown in full as the annex to the covering reports from pages 18 to 23. It details the findings against each of the 5 points that have been outlined in paragraph 1 as the terms of reference that I was to undertake. The sections that follow in paragraph 3 from findings under each of the 3.1, 3.2 then summarise the key issues under each of those requirements under the terms of reference. And that covers all of the 5 points. This has resulted in 3 recommendations being made, and page 30 shows these in summary in the action plan. And the Council has agreed to undertake the recommendations. The timeline at Appendix 1 on page 25, I think helpfully contains links to key documents of interest that support the findings of the review, and the hyperlinks would link you, when everything's working, ordinarily to those key documents. And I think paragraph 4 on page 23 records the conclusion against each of the 5 tasks on the terms of reference, and that automatically those conclusions lead to the 3 recommendations. I'd like to conclude that the governance arrangements are set to a high standard and did operate as expected. The recommendations that have been made are really designed to enhance those current arrangements that are in place. I'm happy to take any questions or to hand to Jan at this time. Thank you.
Thank you. So in relation to recommendation 1, our planning officers have added a declaration to the site submission form so that we can identify if a landowner is an officer, a member or related to one of those. They've also updated a process note requiring planning officers to record such a declaration has been reviewed and the monitoring officer notified. The form and the process note will be considered by MT for approval this week. No amendments are needed to the Constitution in relation to those proposals. In relation to recommendation 2, it's confirmed that amendments will be made to, or will be suggested to be made to, the Members' Code of Conduct, requiring all members to register unpaid directorships as other registrable interests. I've met with Kent Secretary's working group and agreed, because of course this is a Kent-wide code, so we work closely with other monitoring officers and head of legal at other authorities across Kent. It's helpful to work in a group like that, safety in numbers, and they've all felt that that would be a really helpful addition. We've all been in a position where members have found it quite confusing in relation to the regulations requiring directorships to be registered in certain circumstances. I propose that delegated authority is granted to me as monitoring officer to make the necessary changes to the Members' Code of Conduct and any other related sections of the Constitution. For example, there are some procedure rules stating when members with an DPI and an OSI can speak at certain meetings. So I'd need to just go through the Constitution and check whether any of those need that consequential amendment. Ordinarily, I would make those amendments as track changes and produce those, but I'm just not in a position to do so at the moment without access to the system. In relation to Regulation 3, I'm happy to recommend that the control sheet regarding Section 32 sensitive interests requests is adopted as presented in Appendix 3 of the governance review. That can be retained by myself once completed. I would just suggest that we add the wording of Section 32 to that second page, just a helpful reminder of the requirements there or the test. Again, that form is to be considered by management team this week, and I would also need to check whether there are any amendments required to the Constitution that follow from that. So again, that delegated authority would be helpful. So next steps, reports will go to the Standards Committee regarding all this on the 7th of February, the Governance Committee on the 13th of February, and to Council on the 22nd of February to note the new forms and process notes. Hopefully they'll be approved by MT, and to provide that delegated authority to me to make those necessary amendments to the Constitution.
Thank you for those reports. We're just going to open up to the floor to debate. Councillor Rod.
Thank you, Chair. As we're all aware, there's been considerable public interest in the series of articles that appeared in Private Eye and to a lesser extent in the local press, including the Gazette, concerning the sites owned by former councillors that were included in the draft local plan. I think the Private Eye articles summarise the facts. In the interests of openness and transparency, I'd like to say that I have met briefly the former council leader, but only at the election counts. I had no meetings with him prior to that. And I've not, to the best of my knowledge, met the other councillors named in the press, the Jones-Roberts. So my interest in this matter is not at all personal, and it's not directed at any individuals. Nor is it party political, because I'd have the same concerns whichever party the former councillors belong to. And I don't know if these allegations have any substance or not. But I do know that these allegations deserve a proper investigation. And I'm more interested in seeing that a proper investigation is carried out than I have in the outcome. So I want to be able to report back to my residents who elected me and who've expressed concern about the private eye articles that a proper investigation is being carried out. So has there been an investigation into the facts? The ECAP review that we have before us tonight states in its terms of reference, ECAP's work will not include any investigation that would normally be carried out by the monitoring officer as a code of conduct complaint. So the terms of reference of the ECAP review scrupulously avoid the key issue that's at the heart of this, which is how did a substantial piece of land owned by a serving councillor end up in the draft local plan without declarations being made. Furthermore, the ECAP review has no remit to explore the 7 Nolan principles of public life and if they were breached. And that, of course, is what the public want to know and deserve to know. The scope of the ECAP review is merely to look at the processes and how they could be improved. So there's not been an investigation, in the true sense of the word, in the ECAP review. So have officers conducted an investigation? So Councillor Dixie, the deputy leader, shared with me an email sent to him from the monitoring officer on the 5th of September. And that says, in the process of assisting in answering numerous FOI requests regarding this matter, the senior management team, including the monitoring officer, have investigated the circumstances surrounding the issues raised. So I thought when I read that, that's great. I can back off. I don't have to press on with this. There's been an investigation. But before I went back to my residents for reassurance, I asked for a copy of the written reports, meeting notes, emails, etc., that enabled officers and the monitoring officer to make that above statement, make the statement in her email. The response I got was as follows. We have no written reports, meeting notes, or emails. We have no meeting reports, notes, or emails. Does that sound like a proper investigation of the facts has been conducted? Can I really assure my residents that this receives the attention it deserves? Just to be clear on this point, and just to be clear that I'd understood the situation correctly, I sent an email to the monitoring officer on the 21st of December last year saying, I take it from the above that the council's position is that the process of investigating the circumstances surrounding the serious and potentially criminal allegations made against former councillors that featured in the national press did not generate any written reports, meeting notes or emails, and more specifically, the collation of information did not generate any written reports, meeting notes or emails. I'd be grateful if you confirm my understanding of your and the council's position. And the reply I received from the monitoring officer by email dated the 21st of December 2023 was, that is correct. So there has been no investigation. There's no investigation in the ECAP review and no investigation by council officers either. So who or what is responsible for investigating these serious allegations? And I don't know sufficient of the facts behind them and the truth or otherwise of the allegations that have been made. Well, the council's web pages are very helpful on this point. It says in the government arrangements that the responsibility for looking at this lies with this committee, the Audit Committee. So my question to fellow councillors and to you, Chair, if I may, is to say, how are we going to fulfil our obligations and commission a proper investigation of the facts? Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Auld. Does anybody else want to come in before I go back to the officers and I'll outline the questions that have been raised? Okay, can you hear? Okay, if everybody can speak into the microphone clearly, that would be appreciated. If there's no other hands, so I think, have you, Jan, have you written down the questions that came from, so I'll pass you over to respond.
So firstly, to clarify, you mentioned, Councillor Old, that no declarations were made when the site was added to the draft local plan. That's actually incorrect. They were made. So at the point that the property was purchased, the former councillors did register that interest in the property. So that declaration was made. You mentioned the known principles, and of course they are very important, but the key again is about whether there's a breach of the members' code of conduct, and we do need to adhere to the arrangements for dealing with councillor conduct complaints. As monitoring officer, it's my role to deal with any complaints received regarding the conduct of councillors. I have only received one complaint regarding this matter on the 6th of September. At that point, the owners of the site were no longer councillors, and the arrangements require that in those circumstances, the complaint fails at the first screening test. So I have followed the arrangements in place that are within the Constitution. In terms of investigation, as I say, only one complaint received, but numerous FOIs received, and it was in the course of collating all the information and the answers to those FOIs, we were able to establish the key points, which were the ownership of the site was declared, was registered by the councillors, and the councillors took no part in any decision making regarding the draft local plan. There's been only one decision made by the council in relation to the draft local plan so far. It was a cabinet decision merely to go out to consultation on the draft. I think I've covered most aspects, but happy to
I think,
take any further
thank you
queries.
for that. I'll come back to Councillor Auld if he wants to come back, but I think he also asked, and the main, I think the main focus was whether there was an internal investigation by officers, and were there any notes, minutes, anything that can be observed and passed on and circulated through an FOI. And he also asked that who or what organisation will investigate the internal communications if that wasn't the scope of the internal audit.
So there's not a specific investigation report because, as I say, I received only one complaint and that was dealt with and failed at that first hurdle. In dealing with the FOIs, I think we've already disclosed this, but happy to disclose it again. The answers to a couple of very detailed FOIs that dealt with all the points that I've made, that we were able to clarify that ownership of the site had been declared and that the members or former councillors took no part in decision making. Those are the key tests. I appreciate you know, the importance of the Nolan principles needing to be adhered to, but it comes down to did the councillors declare those interests, and did they attempt to gain an advantage by their position as a councillor? And we can be clear in those investigations that we undertook for the FOIs that neither the declaration appropriately occurred and there was no involvement in any decision making. And in relation to internal comms, the FOIs, we had so many of them at the time that we were dealing with them in meetings. So I'm afraid we didn't have a record other than the FOI response. but we felt that they were so detailed, it dealt with the key points.
Thank you. Would you like to come back, Councillor Old?
Just on the issue of the divulgence of ownership of the site. On the 14th of the 12th, 2022, a former councillor put in a request about who he did know some of the detail, so he was asking for a question he knew the answer to. He put in a request about knowledge of the ownership of the site, asking that it be provided. And there was no divulgence made at that time. And that was on the 14th of the 12th, 2022. I have the details of that, which I'm happy to forward to you. Could I also point out that in the ECAP review, just below 3.2, there is one issue that we can't leave hanging, and that is where it says, give me just for a second. Under Part 8, it would appear that Part B, brackets 2, does apply to this case, meaning that this should have been declared under 8 Part G. Whether or not this is a breach of the Localism Act 2011 or not is outside the scope of this review. We can't leave that hanging without a proper answer to it. Thank you.
Would you like to come back to respond?
I'm afraid I don't recall the correspondence of the 14th of December 2022. I don't know if that came to myself or who that went to. And in relation to 3.2, I understand that that is subject to a police investigation, so we can't comment on that any further.
Would you like to come back?
Rather than just continue the to and fro, I think it's very likely, given that the police are under such pressure that we all know about, that the police will take a lead from the council and will ask the council if there are unresolved issues here. If the council don't suggest there are unresolved issues, then I think it's unlikely the police are going to be interested at this stage. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. I just don't think it's for us to speculate about the outcome of a police investigation, so I don't think we can comment on that one.
Can we be clear that that specific issue has been reported to the police by council officers?
We understand that someone has referred it to the police, but I can't comment any further.
But just to be clear, council officers have not reported the issue that's pointed out in its own ECAP report. They've not reported that to the police.
For the benefit of the residents that are listening to the webcast, the officers are just communicating before they respond. Thank you.
My understanding is that officers of the council did not report it, but a member of the public did.
Chairman, I would suggest that it's not correct that we rely on members of the public to report issues that are rightly the concern of the council. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Old. Do you have a recommendation for us, or if any other members of the committee would like to speak and have a recommendation? Mr. Stockley, Councillor Stockley, sorry.
It's Councillor Jones, actually, but to be... That's all right,
Sorry, my
Chairman.
notes
I've
are
been
wrong.
called a lot
Councillor
worse,
Jones.
I can assure you of that, don't worry. Going on, listening to Councillor Old and going back to his beginning of his first statement where, you know, the public, we have a duty to serve the public, that's why we're here. And when we get down to a situation, it's the clarity and openness and transparency and the Nolan principles are all kind of come together with it all. And it's very difficult sometimes to to cut through all that. And I think from councillors' point of view and the process we have to go through within our council is clunky. It's not, it is open and transparent if you know the system and how it works within councillors, but the public who look in don't see that. It's almost, you almost wish, it sounds really silly what I'm going to say, is that you sang it, everything that people need to know, like Julie Andrews and The Sound of Music. You know, you need to be that open and clear and transparent so people understand from the get-go, rather than people they think they find something out and then it all starts to fall to bits when it's not. Because I was going to ask the question, and whoever did the timeline, you've got someone who did all the timeline, so you must have collated all that information from people, officers, to come all the way down, because these are the facts what actually happened. So, and that's the thing, is trying to get people to understand and see that. But it's from the very beginning. I mean, I'll speak about myself here, and not the same situation by no means, but you're talking about the Nolan principles and how people are, and how you think and how you're perceived within council and whatever. 2 years ago, I was not a councillor, but historically I have been. And members may recall last year I sent an email round to response to someone asking a question after this came up, not long after election, saying, is there any more councillors got land on the local plan? Well, 2 years ago, I put a bit of land next to my property onto the local plan for whatever reasons. I explained it in my email. However, the moment I was elected, I withdrew it. I withdrew it for be clear, transparent and open and honest, because I felt as an individual that wasn't my place, and to be elected and then to have something where I could benefit. It's mine, I could sell it and do what I like with it anyway, but in that forum. So it's difficult for the people to understand. It's judging whether, you know, if it's gone to the police and they're investigating something, if there's a criminal act, but or not. I don't know. I don't know the situation. To be honest, I didn't know of the situation until I was actually re-elected. But I think it's so difficult where councillors are involved in it, even from planning. There's no real nuts and bolts framework for it. It's easy to fall off, and it's hard for us as councillors to then, you know, explain to the public, say, oh, well, how, you know, they say that our bloody typical councillors, you're in it, you know, for yourselves, and it's not necessarily the case, although it looks like the case on face value. But there's so many parameters to it, and that's why I felt when I came back in. Well, that's why I removed mine from the local plan. But one thing I would like to say, if at all possible, to help scenarios, because that is the case, I removed it by the 15th of May. I've got all the documentation from planning, and in the legal team had the necessary email trail. But the planning authority still keeps, to this very day, my ask of my bit of land up there in the public view all to see. So I could tell people I've removed it, and I'd have to go around and show my email chain and everything. All they had to do is remove it, and I have asked that to be done because I have removed it. But no one has still removed it, so it's still there for public view. So one thing's not helpful in one way. Do you understand what I mean? It's, if we're going to have a process where we can be sort of open, clear and transparent about things, we need to be able to react when things change, and that hasn't happened in this particular case. But it's a difficult situation. I don't know what the end thing is, but all I know is that you know, you follow the guidelines, you listen to people, and you declare when you need to declare it. But the Nolan principles are pretty strong, and it's you as an individual, how you feel within your role within council is really key, in my opinion, and that's all I'll say on that, Chairman. Okay, sorry if I've gone on.
Thank you, Councillor Jones. More of a statement and a declaration, so thank you for demonstrating that. So this item is to note unless there are any recommendations from the floor. Councillor Buckman.
Yeah, so I just want to add a little bit to what my colleague over there was saying about public perception and how, you know, and playing the game, and, you know, everything's been going on about the PPE and things like that. But I noticed on the on the audit, there's all things about risk assessments. So is there a way of having some sort of risk assessment that would have contents about sort of if it's in a public interest, how public would perceive things, if it opens up the council to further scrutiny. Would this make a higher rating, like number 3, whatever the higher rating is? And could this be brought forward? So if things like this come again, it would be a risk, and it would then, if it's a high risk, it would make for further investigation. And then there was just one point when you said about, sorry, that thing about it fails because they're former councillors. Does it, obviously, it's different than if they're current councillors or not? What would happen? Just briefly, if you, because I don't know. Thanks.
Thank you, Jane. Would you like to come back, Jen?
So if they were still serving councillors and I received a complaint, then it would be considered. I would go through the 2 screening tests that we have. The first one is whether they're still an existing councillor, so they would pass that one. The second one, I would look at whether it's been investigated already. So you could take the view, having looked at all the issues under the FOIs, whether it needed to go to an independent investigation. But yeah, it could go for an investigation at that point if it was felt necessary.
Thank you. Councillor Harvey.
Thank you, Chair. My concern about this in particular, apart from all the other things that people have said that I agree with, is that on the one hand, our officers are saying it might be a criminal offence and police matter, and therefore they're not going to deal with it. But then they're also not reporting it to the police and relying on a member of the public. And we can't expect members of the public to be familiar with the Localism Act, or perhaps for the police to take it seriously coming from a member of the public where they would from the council. So can we make a recommendation that if officers become aware of any possible offence, that they report it themselves to the police?
Thank you. Would you like to come back on that?
It's already in our constitution as part of the arrangements for dealing with complaints regarding councillor conduct, that if it transpires that it could potentially be a criminal offence, that the complainant be advised to report it to the police. So that's currently in the constitution. So if members wanted to change that to require the monitoring officer to report it to the police, that would have to go to council to be amended. Some local authorities have that for the monitoring officer to report. Some are similar to this council, where they go back to the claimant and suggest if they have evidence that they go to the police.
Thank you. Is that a proposal from the floor? Okay, so a recommendation to take that proposal to the Governance and Standard Committee.
Yes, please, Chair.
Could you repeat the wording for the proposal, please? And I would need a seconder following the proposal words.
The Constitution be changed to note that if officers become aware of any possible offence by a councillor, that they themselves report it to the police.
And do I have a seconder? Councillor Roberts. We need to. Would you like to come back, Councillor Carr-Ellis?
Yeah, I have a question actually. On page 20 of the report, it does actually say, second last paragraph, it does actually question whether there was a breach of the Localism Act, but says this is outside the scope of this review. If that is the case, how can we then investigate this if nobody is going to report it from the council? After looking more closely at the provision under Part 8, however, it would appear that Part B1 does apply to this case, as the shares held exceed 1/100th of the total issue shared capital in CCH Milton Manor Park Limited, meaning that this should have been declared under 8 Part G. Whether this is a breach of the Localism Act 2011 or not is outside the scope of this review. To me, it seems that we need to investigate whether this was a breach of the Act or not. We're under, we are obliged on behalf of our residents.
Would you like to come back, Jen?
That's not the process, I'm afraid. The process is that the monitoring officer deal with complaints regarding the conduct of councillors. When it comes to a potential non-declaration of a disclosable pecuniary interest, that is for the police to investigate.
So again, that means unless a member of the public investigates, it will never be investigated. Unless a member of the public raises it with the police.
Well, the Constitution currently requires that any complainant is advised to report the matter to the police if they raise such a matter. And we've just had a recommendation that we take forward that the Constitution is amended.
I agree. I just find it quite abhorrent that something could be considered a misdemeanour of an act of Parliament, and yet there is no commitment on the part of this council to be able to raise that to the police.
Would you like to come back, Tricia?
Thank you, Chair. But I mean, Jan's probably better qualified to answer this one than me. But I think the issue you've probably got is with the regime that the government has set up to manage councillor conduct. And they have devised it in this particular way with these different roles. It was, I don't know when it was changed, a good few years ago. It was 2011. 2011. It was before then. It was probably a more helpful regime, but since 2011, this is the regime we have to live with, which is actually quite a difficult one to get your head around. But that is the regime that that government at that time introduced, and that's the regime that we have to work within. So it has these separations in terms of who's responsible for investigating different things.
I'm not talking so much. Yes, I'm not talking so much about investigating, but raising the matter in the first place. Surely, if anybody in this council, including councillors, sees something that could be a possible breach of the Localism Act in terms of the Nolan Principles, it's upon us to highlight this.
You need to follow the process in our constitution. So that's a complaint to the monitoring officer regarding the conduct of that councillor. Only one was received. And if it was raised within that complaint that it was a potential DPI breach or breach of the legislation, then the monitoring officer would advise the claimant to report it to the police. I've got to work with the process that we've got. I appreciate the frustrations around this, but this has been worked on with monitoring officers across Kent. It's something that we've all had to grapple with. We use the Kent Code. So I'm more than happy to discuss amendments, but we still need to stick to the legislation that's in place, and it's quite tricky.
And one final comment, Councillor Carr-Ellis, and then we'll follow the proposal. Councillor Franklin, did you want to come in after that? And then I also have a recommendation. Thank you.
I understand you're following the process, but to me it sounds very much like washing of our hands of the issue. I know that's not how it is, and you have to do your job and you have to follow the process. To me, as a member of the public until last May, that's how it appears.
Councillor Franklin, would you like to come back in?
Thank you, Chair. Yeah, it's just to make a statement as being one of the councillors who is next to this plan. And yeah, there was a lot of local residents and a lot of local councillors who raised this issue with me during the election. And a lot of them used the words like sleaze. A lot of them used the words of typical councillors, typical council. I think not having a proper investigation is going to be really damaging for the council and its reputation. I think a lot of people are looking at this, not only in my ward, but as I've spoken with other councillors, a lot of people in their wards as well, a lot of residents are looking at this and going, something isn't right here. I feel like someone has gained something. Now, whether they have or not, you know, that's obviously for either the police or a far more robust investigation to take place. But currently, I can't see this report going back to residents and residents going, oh yeah, that's fair enough. As Councillor Auld has mentioned, we can't get the minutes of these meetings that have been taken place in order to look into this. It's I don't know how to say it, but it's not going to look good, I think, and it's going to damage the council's reputation. And and then of course there's the Nolan principles. These whole things are all coming together as one, and I think it's going to get really damaged if we go ahead and go, well, this is okay. We have done this version of an investigation. And we'll move on. I don't think a lot of my residents, at least, will look at that and be happy with it.
Thank you, Councillor Franklin. Would an officer like to come back, and then we'll speak about the recommendation?
Thank you, Chair. Yes, I think the recommendation, together with the recommendation in the report, the work that Jan is going to do with the other monetary officers on the Kent Code will address that issue around the interest issue, because that will clarify the reporting, and also it will clarify for councillors what they do and don't need to declare, which is quite a complex area to get to grips with. And I think we as officers had quite a lot of discussion about what exactly was meant by particular things at particular times, and we had quite a lot of debate on that. I think going back to Councillor Franklin's point, and I understand the concerns, and none of us like councillors or officers who also get accused of all sorts of things, being accused of things, and we all need to abide by the Nolan principles. I just go back to the points that Jan made earlier, which was actually when this site was put in for the local plan, the fact that it was owned by councillors was declared at the earliest opportunity, and the councillors concerned did not take any part in the decision process of putting that draft local plan out to consultation. So there's lots of concern about this, but actually if you go back to those facts and you go back to the timeline which Christine Parker has helpfully put together in the appendix to the report, you can actually see all those facts laid out. Thanks, Chair.
Thank you. So we've got a recommendation tabled by Councillor Harvey and seconded by Councillor Jones, and it reads:
the Constitution be amended that any council, in bracket officers, that are aware of a possible offence by a councillor report this themselves to the police.
And that will go to the Governance Committee and the Standards Committee, I believe, that recommendation. So we will be having a vote. Anyone in favour? Show of hands. That's unanimous. Thank you. Good discussion, thank you. We now move on to item 7. Councillor Auld.
Chair, thank you for your forbearance. But just to be clear, that when it was said that the appropriate declarations were made, when the Cabinet received the report draft local plan seeking to approval to consult on the 19th of the 10th, 2022, the leader of the council took sole responsibility for overseeing the draft local plan, and it would appear at that time no other Cabinet members knew that the Milton Manor site was to be included, nor did they know who owned that site. So it's not correct that declarations were available to the people who were making that decision.
Thank you, Councillor Auld. That's being minuted. Would an officer like to come back, and then we must move on.
Okay, so just I suppose one last quick comment from me is that in all of our meetings, as you all know as councillors, all councillors have the opportunity to declare their interests at that meeting, or to declare those interests in advance. So if any of the people at that meeting felt that they had an interest or they had a relationship, then they had the opportunity to declare that. So in terms of our processes, that's the correct thing to do. We as officers cannot comment on what the closeness of relationship was between individual councillors. That's not something that we can really pick up through an audit process.
Would you like to come back, Councillor Rold?
I'm sorry, but the closeness to the relationship isn't the point. The point is that the committee that was voting on going out to consultation was unaware that one of the development sites included in the consultation was owned by one of their fellow councillors. Thus, they were unable to scrutinise that aspect of the draft local plan. Are we really going to move on without coming to any decision about having a further investigation? Because, as my fellow councillors have said, I think my local residents are going to be very disconcerted at least, and very unhappy that we haven't taken sufficient action to look back at what's happened and investigate this properly.
Thank you, Councillor Rold. So we can't action a further investigation. We can make a recommendation from the floor. I asked, following the recommendation from Councillor Harvey, if there were further recommendations. Sorry, they're not an investigation, recommendation. There weren't, but I'm opening it up to the floor now. Before we move on, are there any further recommendations that we would like to put forward from this committee?
I recommend that there is an investigation instigated by this committee into potential code of conduct failures by former Canterbury City councillors, and looking specifically at were necessary declarations of pecuniary and significant interest made when the land became a potential major development site. Secondly, the role of the council leader in selecting sites for the local plan and his knowledge of the ownership of the sites. Did he fail to declare that his fellow councillors had put forward a site for inclusion in the draft local plan for which he was responsible as portfolio holder within the Cabinet? And a final point, if I may, what would be the implications for this site going into the new draft local plan?
Naturally, we're trying to transcribe that recommendation. So if you could say it again, but a little bit.
What's the recommendation? Yeah.
If you could say just the recommendation and a little bit slower, so we can transcribe that.
To instigate an investigation into potential code of conduct failures by former Canterbury City councillors. Were the necessary declarations of pecuniary and significant interests made by the former councillors when the land became a potential major development site? Secondly, the role of the former council leader in selecting sites for the local plan and his knowledge of the ownership of those sites. Did he fail to declare that his fellow councillors had put forward a site for inclusion in the draft local plan for which he was responsible as the portfolio holder within the Cabinet?
Thank you for that. So the recommendation would need to go to a committee. That would go to the Cabinet Committee. Now, there would be issues with impartiality because there are councillors within the Cabinet Committee that were present during that time. Maybe we need to look at that proposal and then see how the council can come to an agreement to be able to facilitate that within the council's constitution and actions. I'll pass over to an officer.
Within the current constitution, it's the arrangements for dealing with council conduct complaints that covers this. And the first screening test would fail because they are no longer councillors. And the issue is really covered by recommendation 1 of the audit report, where we now have that declaration on the form where members or officers or relatives of them need to declare if they own a site being put forward for a draft local plan going forward, and the process note requiring the planning officers to report that to the monitoring officer. So then that could be stated at a future meeting where that was being considered.
So those specific questions and recommendations, if they come back to this committee answered by officers, would that satisfy this further debate? And then if we do not have answers to those between now and then, we can find out what the other levers and what other processes can occur. Come in.
Thank you, Chair. I think Jan has set out in our constitution how we would carry out such an investigation, which is by the monitoring officer into the councillor's into the councillor conduct. Because I think that's the essence of what Councillor Old is asking for, is an investigation into the conduct of certain councillors. Jan has explained why such an investigation would fail at the first hurdle, which is the councillors concerned are no longer councillors of the council. So you can't investigate them, you can't compel them to take part, you can't compel them to give any evidence. It just falls at that first hurdle. There's no sanctions. And there's no sanctions that could be applied to them because they are already former councillors. So constitutionally, that's any officer investigation would follow that route, which is the route that Jan has already followed, following a complaint from the member of the public. So there is no further officer route that we can take. I completely understand the questions about, people wanting to be reassured and get absolute transparency. I completely understand that. But that's the process in terms of our constitution, and that route has already been pursued. Any other investigation by anyone else, I suspect would just fall down in terms of practicalities of not being able to compel anyone to take part in it. Thank you, Chair.
Before I come to you, Councillor Franklin, would it be correct in saying, so we have the recommendation that the monitoring officer, if they observe wrongdoing of a possible alleged criminal nature, then they will report it to the police. If that goes to the Governance and Standards Committee and they relook to see that paragraph that says that it might break, I can't see one of the acts, the Localism Act, then that would oblige the monitoring officer to report this to the police themselves. Would that satisfy this committee that with this investigation will not is not being buried, but within the confines of the council and the investigations that have occurred, this is then moving it to an area that can be then investigated for criminality? So are we satisfied with the recommendation that's tabled by Councillor Harvey and Councillor Jones? And would you like to retract the recommendation because it doesn't seem to be feasible within the boundaries of the structure of this council and within the constitution? Councillor Oldham.
It was said there would be practicalities that might prevent it. I'm still waiting to hear what the practicalities are that might prevent us, the council, commissioning an external investigation.
Commissioning an external investigation, is that what your recommendation was? So then if that's commissioning an external investigation, then that will then go to, that recommendation would then go to the cabinet to vote on. If you've streamlined and clarified your recommendation that you recommend an external investigation and that goes to cabinet to vote on, then that just makes it
Thank you, Chair. I think in terms of Councillor Old's question about practicalities, just as a reminder, I did mention that these are now former councillors and there is no way anyone could actually compel them to take part in an investigation. I see that as quite a serious practical issue with any investigation by anyone, regardless of whether they're internal or they're external. an investigation would need to take resources. So I think probably the first step on that, if you want to make a recommendation, would be through to Cabinet, and then Cabinet would consider practicalities of that. Thank you.
So we have a second recommendation proposed by Councillor Old. Do I have a seconder? Seconded by Councillor Franklin, and that's to recommend that an external investigation is carried out, and that recommendation will be going to Cabinet to discuss and to vote on. Can we have a show of hands for? So that's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And do we have any against? And no abstentions. Thanks. So that's 2 recommendations. They're going to be minuted. And if nobody has anything else, Councillor Frank.
It was just a point of clarification. So hypothetically, let's say a councillor does something wrong, like not declaring something in council, immediately resigns, not becomes and is not a councillor, then we can't investigate them? Sorry, I'm just a bit confused on this. Could you just elaborate on that more, please?
That's right. The arrangements state that at the time you're making that assessment, having received a complaint, if they are no longer a councillor at that point, then the complaint fails.
Is
1 second, Councillor Franklin, and one final comment through the chair, please.
sorry. Is that not problematic that, you know, someone could just get out of this chamber as soon as they do something problematic or something that benefits them, and that we can't investigate them? Is that not something we should look into as possibly resolving?
If you'd like to come back.
Again, the arrangements have been considered by local authorities across Kent, so we have a Kent arrangements as well as a code. The problem you have is once they're no longer a councillor, you can't make any sanctions. So I suppose there might be circumstances where you investigate, but actually if you've not got the sanctions at the end of them, I think that's why we're in the position that we are, that we have that screening test, because you can't compel them to cooperate, and you've got no sanctions at the end of it. That's the difficulty, the practical difficulties.
Thank you. I think this has had a really good debate. We've got 2 recommendations, and the recommendations are going to the Governance Committee, the Standards Committee, and the Cabinet. I think if there's anything further, then we do have members, and they are able to attend those committees and table questions if they give the officers prior notice that they would like to speak as a member. We're now going to move on to item 7. And I apologise first that I didn't introduce Rob May, who's the new Head of Finance. Item 7 is the half-yearly Treasury Management Report that Nikki is going to speak on it.
Thank you, Chair. First of all, I just have to apologise. I've got a locket in my mouth and I've got a horrible cough. So if I can get through this without coughing, it'll be great. So this is the half-yearly Treasury Monitoring Report. We used to provide this just once a year to Audit Committee at the half-yearly point. Now we are required to present it quarterly, which is a SIPFA recommended good practice. So this is the second time you're receiving this update for this financial year. When we've been reviewing this data in light of this new requirement every quarter, there shouldn't be and isn't much change from each quarter. The report shows the borrowing levels and compares against the limits we have in the strategies. And as you're aware, we have some long-term borrowings and a proportion of short-term borrowings, which are all detailed in the report. For context, pre-COVID, there will be a time when I don't use that word, pre-COVID, but at the moment it's relevant. Pre-COVID, we had up to £30 million in short-term borrowing, which was regularly refinanced every year. So this amount does fluctuate up and down depending on the need, and it will be affected by interest rate changes. As you will see at the time of writing on page 35, we had £12 million of short-term borrowing, which the borrowing costs obviously do fluctuate each year, but they're just for a short period of time. So when the interest rate decreases, it will be refinancing at that lower rate. But this just gives us the flexibility for borrowing as and when it's needed, rather than locking into longer term agreements for the full amount of our borrowing requirement. The Treasury activity section on page 37 shows that I've got a more recent update for that the interest rates we receive on the bank call account, we have negotiated an increase to 3.25%, which was actioned in December. And the other money market funds are currently all above 5% at the moment. All of the compliance indicators and limits are showing compliance, except the one showing the split of maturity for 5 to 10 years, which will fluctuate depending on the amount of short-term borrowing we have. However, you will remember at the last meeting, councillors requested some further detail on the maturity structure of our loans, which is in the table on 39 and 40. If we had the original table of payments, it would show the split, and it would show the split was compliant, which is based on payments rather than maturity. I have discussed this with our advisors and looking at the SIP for guidance. And for the next report, we will show both, because the maturity is one bit of information that councillors are interested in, as well as the SIP for guidance that we have to abide by. So it's a balance of complying with the code and providing you with meaningful information. Happy to take any questions. Thank you.
Thank you. Do we have any questions from the floor? I'm seeing nothing. I've just got a very quick one. You've covered most of my questions. I'm just wondering, when does this committee get more up-to-date information on finances? I know we've got the budget coming up, etc., the information, but what comes to this committee? And you mentioned the maturity and the targets that we've gone over some percentage targets. They're going to be increasing because obviously the 0 to 5, or within 12 months they're going to be paid off. We're not going to be refinancing them. So then the target will then there'll be an increase further, and it will be over that target. What happens then? Because our loans that are going to be paid off sooner, those targets are going to be stretched. So what happens to that? Do we adjust them, or just a bit of information there? Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. On the first point about the under 12 months being paid off, that's part of short-term borrowing that is constantly refinanced, so that we have a proportion that is short-term borrowing. So that is reflected, affected by the current interest rates that fluctuates up and down. At the March Audit Committee, this report will be updated for Q3. It's just the timing sometimes doesn't quite align with when the information is available, so you'll get an update in March. Was that everything covered?
Yeah, so just come back. So within 12 months, we're going to refinance. What rates? Obviously, they're not great at the moment. What rates are they going to be at, and what losses are we going to be having from refinancing them?
Yeah, we take our treasury as a whole, and there's refinancing planned in some of those borrowings, including the short term. At the moment, it's looking at 5.5% is the current level, but it's always short term for a few months, or at the maximum for a year. So that's our strategy, and that's the recommendation from the Treasury advisors, to give us that flexibility. And as you can see, in previous years, we've had up to £30 million of short-term borrowing. At the moment, at this point, we were 12. So it's all managed as a whole for all of our borrowing needs. And we try and keep the borrowing as low as possible, depending on what cash flow we need. But yes, there will be some increase in interest rates, and that is covered in the budget, but then also the interest rates are helping the overnight investments as well. So it balances it out.
Okay, thank you. Any questions from Councillor Old, and then we'll come to Councillor Harvey.
I promise to be much briefer on this occasion. Just because I'm a new councillor and I don't understand the scale of these things, how does our debt interest repayment compare to other councils in Kent?
And if Councillor Harvey wants to come in, and then if you take both the questions, if you're able to jot them down. It's not a memory test.
Thank you, Chair. No, it was just a simple bit of clarification, really, on the Whitefriars investment. There's 2 paragraphs there, and the second one just refers to the, no, the screen's gone blank, the authority holding one investment. I've lost it now. I presume that second paragraph actually refers to a part of Whitefriars that we've held for a longer period, does it? I'm just curious on that. Thanks.
Sorry, you may have to repeat that second question because I was making a note then and I wasn't listening to all of it.
Good,
Sorry.
a chance to get my screen up and then see it again. Thank you. Yeah, the 2 paragraphs under the Whitefriars section, and the second one says the authority holds one investment that has been held for many years of 2.3 million for commercial purposes. And I just take it that is part of Whitefriars that we held previously. Is it or for longer? Thanks.
Thank you, Chair. That is not Whitefriars. That is the one investment property that we have. Do you remember where it is? But yeah, it's not Whitefriars. It's just one other property. And in answer to the first question, compared to other councils, I think there is data that we are high in comparison to some other councils, but we have purchased all of Whitefriars in the past, and some of that was from borrowing. We've also have a HRA stock that a number of years ago we purchased all of our stock from government and we had to borrow for that, so that increases that. And some councils don't have HRA, and some councils don't have a Whitefriars for regeneration purposes either, so that sort of has increased us compared to others. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. The second part to your question, would you be satisfied with a written response with the detail of that? And the comparison, would it be good, beneficial to have a comparison table sent out to members of this committee, comparing us to, I don't want to give you extra work, but comparing us to other councils? There must be that information that we can circulate.
Thank you, Chair. Yeah, there is SIP for benchmarking information out there that it might be a couple of years old now, but we can. There is an updated one, I am told. We can provide that.
Is the members satisfied with those being circulated? Councillor Harvey? Yep. So this is to note, we'll do that by general assent. Do we have that? Is that agreed? Agreed. Thank you. Sir Alden Franklin, we're just asking if you agree that by general assent. Thank you. We are moving on to item 8, East Kent Audit Partnership Internal Quarterly Audit Report. And this is to consider the report. And I'll pass you over to Christine. Chris. Sorry.
Thank you, Chair. The report before you on page 42 is the normal internal audit update report that you see, which comes to each committee. If I can take you to page 45, this shows the main reports that have been completed in the period. You'll see that there's been 6 that have been completed. The assurances range from substantial to reasonable, and then there are 2 not applicables as well. The complaints management survey is not applicable because that's a consultative piece of work, and the housing benefit testing is just some data analysis. Moving on to page 50, This shows the follow-ups that have been completed within the period. And again, there's 3 here, and they all come out at substantial assurance. And then on page 54, this shows the progress of the audit plan. This is to the half-year period. And just to bring those figures up to the end of December, Canterbury is now running at 62% and EKS at 57%. And there are various reviews being undertaken for Canterbury and EKS at the moment to bring those figures up. So those are the main highlights of this report, and be pleased to take any questions you may have. Thank you.
Thank you. I propose that this committee accepts the results of internal audit work and makes comments, if required, to full council. I seek a seconder. Thank you, Councillor Carr-Ellis. And we open this up to debate. I have quite a few questions. And these questions are either to Christine or Christopher or officers. We're looking at licensing. It mentions a recommendation that there should be a performance information document that should be circulated to the committee or to senior officers. Is there a performance information document? If not, why? And is there a timeline for this to be produced and then presented to the licensing committee? That's licensing. I'd like to ask about car parks, and I don't know if there's an officer. Maybe I should have circulated these questions so we could have had a cabinet member or an officer here who could answer this. But on-street parking, it states that there's an income of 658,000 plus permit fees of 758,000. Do these combined cover the overall costs to run and monitor on street? Also a recommendation that there's an improvement list with a number of points. I'm just wondering how we're going to be addressing these. If you'd like to take those two first, so licensing and car parks.
Thank you. Thank you, Chair. On the licensing side, I can confirm that there are some performance information details that are held within the team, and one of the recommendations within the audit report was to provide KPIs to senior management, and that's going to be undertaken. That will obviously be brought back to this committee as part of the follow-up when that is undertaken. The car parks information, unfortunately, I don't have that information to hand. I have tried to find it from the website, and that doesn't show that detail. And I've emailed the head of service, so once I get a response for that, I can let this committee know after the meeting.
Thank you. Nikki, would you like to come back? Thank you, Christopher.
Thank you, Chair. In answer to the licensing question, it does cover the costs. On-street parking, sorry, yeah. It does cover the costs and only slightly above, but it does cover them.
Okay. Thank you for both of those. I'm going to move on to freedom of information. I'm just wondering, does a freedom of information KPI report come to this committee? There's a backlog which ranges in the 100 and something. I'm just wondering what that backlog is today. I believe these figures are up until last September. So if we have anything up to date, if you don't know that, then if that could be circulated. And it says that the disclosure log isn't published, and the recommendation is that if the disclosure log of freedom of information requests and the responses were published, that would make it more efficient and free up officer time. I'm just wondering if we're going to be looking at that proposal, because I think it's a very sensible approach, if we could have that disclosure list on the website, then we won't get as many freedom of information requests because there may be duplications. So I'm just wondering if we are looking into that. Thank you.
Chair, if I may, just on a broader point in terms of our process, because we go through a drafting process of a draft report where we'll agree the factual accuracy and the action plan with all the recommendations will be worked through. By the time the executive summary comes to committee, the bullet points that you see before you generally directly correlate. So the table at the front says how many recommendations there are, and then the bullet points generally relate to what those recommendations are. So these will be agreed actions. And then, of course, in 3 or 6 months' time, we will bring back the progress report, which will tell you, and as you can see in the table today, there are no recommendations outstanding of any of those 3 progress reports that we've brought to the committee. So you can have confidence. The bullet points in our executive summaries link directly to actions management has agreed to, and then have further confidence when we bring back that independent assurance those things have been undertaken. I think in terms of FOI, it isn't the terms of reference of this committee. Obviously, it's an audit that we've undertaken, which has prompted the interest. So the KPI information does go to scrutiny sub and then on to cabinet. So they may have more up-to-date information, but we certainly will be reporting that back at the follow-up report at the next opportunity that we have. I hope that's helpful.
Thank you. That has, and you also stole my thunder because I was going to, and a compliment, it is welcomed that there aren't any recommendations from previously that are outstanding. So that's something really good to read, that we've taken on the actions, we've taken them on board, they've moved from limited and they've improved. So that's really welcome, and look forward to the following report after that. I'm not going to hog the floor, but finally, the satisfaction questionnaires after the audits, and this is directed to the left at officers, that's 31% received. Can we work to increase that percentage, please? Obviously, it is of benefit to both sides, this committee, this council, and to the auditors, that 31% is increased and more of the questionnaires are completed following an audit. So that's just one thing I would like to see improved. But thank you for the report.
Thank you, Chair. May I just add that performance is across the 4 councils. That's the 4. So that is for the partnership. And I did look ahead of the meeting. To the end of December, we've issued 50 questionnaires and we'd had 17 back. So the 30. I'm told 30% range is a really good response rate on these. We do suffer from satisfaction questionnaire fatigue with some areas, because clearly at the close of every audit we seek that feedback. That's part of our professional standards to do that. We don't chase. However, as part of my quality assurance work, I do occasionally pick up the phone and say, you didn't complete a questionnaire. Was there something you wanted to raise at all about the process, the audit? How did we conduct ourselves? I do share the full results with the 4 Section 151 officers at our annual meeting. Be happy to show some of the comments that we get. We are very happy to receive and be happy to share. We have been asked by audit committees in the past to try and chase them down, to try and get that nearer 100%. I think there are different ways of measuring, even your reaction to the reports that we bring forward about the quality of the process that you see. So clearly there could be more effort spent on it, but if there were concerns, then I think that would be something the committee would want to see through further. But it is fairly consistent around the 30% without chasing. Thank you.
Thank you for that information. If we have nothing else on the floor, I propose that this committee accepts the results of internal audit work and makes comments, if required, to full council. We have a minuted comments from this, and we've had a seconder from Councillor Carr Ellis. We have to have a recorded vote. And a show of hands. Has everybody agreed? That's everyone's agreed. Thank you. Now we move to item 9, update report on strategic risk register, and this is to note the verbal update. I bring Nikki Mills in, the Finance and Procurement, Service Director of Finance and Procurement. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. Yeah, it's just an update to say that at the time of writing and publishing this report, there was no change to any of the strategic risk register document, and so that the next audit meeting in beginning of March, you will be receiving an updated risk register in full like you would normally. It was just there was Christmas and there was no change, so at that time of writing. Thank you.
This is to note by general assent. Are we agreed? Thank you. We move on to item 10, Regulation of Investigatory, I can't say that word, Powers Act 2000. This is to note the verbal update of the Service Director, Finance and Procurement, again, and summary of the Head of Legal Services and Monitoring Officer. So I bring in Jan to provide a brief verbal overview of RIPA, including timescales for an annual review.
Thank you. Yes, so the Regulation of Investigatory Powers Act 2000 is a statute that provides a framework that allows the Council to authorise and supervise certain categories of surveillance in a manner that ensures compliance with the Human Rights Act 1998. The local authorities' powers under RIPA are very limited. Local authorities are only allowed to carry out surveillance under RIPA for preventing or detecting a criminal offence which would be punishable by a prison sentence of at least 6 months. So the most common one that we would look at for this is fly tipping. There's 3 types of surveillance techniques available to local authorities. So that's the acquisition of communications data, directed surveillance, which is covert surveillance of individuals in public, and that's the most tricky one and the one that we would most likely seek authorisation for. And there's also covert human intelligence sources, CHIS for short, so that's the deployment of undercover officers. The most relevant right here under the Human Rights Act is right to private and family life. And this is a qualified right, so any interference by the local authority is possible if it's necessary and proportionate and carried out in accordance with legislation. So the idea is that if officers felt that some covert surveillance of individuals would be beneficial to detect a crime, then they would fill in a detailed form where we look at all those aspects. It has to be authorised by a senior officer of the council and then authorised by a magistrate. So a long process. We don't use it very often at all. There's various codes of practice that we must comply with, and the local authorities' use of these powers are kept under review by a commissioner, the Investigatory Powers Commissioner's Office, and we have reviews or inspections every 3 years, roughly. So we need to make sure that we had very good systems for securely maintaining that confidential material that was gained. We'd have to consider the impact of any collateral intrusion on persons other than the subject of the surveillance, and it must be proportionate to what we're seeking to achieve. If we fail to comply with the legislation, the local authority could be ordered to pay compensation for a breach of human rights, and also the evidence could be ruled inadmissible. So that's your prosecution failing, unfortunately, on that basis. So it needs to be very carefully complied with. In terms of frequency in coming to Audit Committee, the code does provide that members of a local authority should review the authority's use of RIPA and set the corporate policy at least annually, and should consider internal reports on the use of RIPA on a quarterly basis to ensure it's being used consistently. As far as I'm aware, there's been no use of RIPA in the time that I've been here in the last 2 years. But but this has reminded me that actually I do need to bring an annual report and review of the policy. So that will come to the next Audit Committee in March. Happy to take any questions.
Do we have any questions from the floor? So committee can seek agreement by general assent during the item to move it to annual updates. Committee in line with regulatory expectations. So this is to note to and agree, and that can. Jan, would you like to comment on that?
Thank you. Yes, so although we need to come annually to look at the policy, the code does require us to consider quarterly whether there has been any instances of RIPA. So I think how we've dealt with that previously is a verbal report, either from myself or another colleague that's here, having heard from me. Obviously, I collate that from officers across the council, but there's been none to date. So it'd be helpful to have that quarterly verbal update and then the annual report.
Thank you. Noted and agreed by general assent. Noted and agreed. Thank you. Item 11, date of the next meeting, 7 p.m. Wednesday, the 13th of March, 2024. Item 12, we don't have any other urgent business to be dealt with in public, and there's 13 no exclusions of the press. So thank you for a good debate and discussion, and have a pleasant evening.